folks.
All right, thank you, Alex, for moderating. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. We have a behind the scenes tour that we have had at the museum for a number of years now. And obviously, with the pandemic, we can't do that. So, we're doing our best here to give you a virtual behind the scenes. And hopefully, in the not too distant future, we'll go back to having those on site programs again. This one looks at the evolution of the Workman House, how it transformed over time. And we have a building that is unusual in many ways because it has components of it that go back to the early 1840s, to the end of the Mexican era of California. There was a major remodeling, renovation that was done about 1870. And that's the basic look of the house that you see today. And then there were other modifications made over the years. For example, when the Temple family bought the homestead in 1917, they spent some time around 1920 making some major improvements, electricity, indoor plumbing, things like that. Later on, the house was used as an institutional headquarters for a school, for a sanitarium, and more recently restored and made part of the Homestead Museum. So a lot to go through this afternoon as we talk about how this house has changed over 180 years. So we'll go back to as far back as we can get in terms of documentation of the house. It's really hard to find information about virtually anything in the greater Los Angeles area when you go back to the 1850s, 1840s, those kinds of periods. The first known description of the building, really it's more just about the existence of the house, was during a testimony by Benjamin D. Wilson. You might know that name from the Wilson Observatory of Mount Wilson above Pasadena. Wilson came with the Workman family to Los Angeles at the end of 1841 from New Mexico. And Wilson became a prominent figure, a mayor of Los Angeles and state senator and farmer and winemaker and that sort of thing. And he was testifying because there was a process of a land claim. So going from Mexico to the United States, the holders of land grants under Mexico and Spain had to go to a commission and present documentary evidence, both written and oral, about their claim. And so for William Workman and his partner, John Rowland, owners of Rancho La Puente, that's what they had to do in the 1850s. So there was a hearing in 1854, and Wilson said, as you can see on the screen here, that Workman had a shanty that he lived in the spring of 1842, shortly after Rowland got the land grant. A shanty would imply a temporary dwelling. Who knows what it was made out of? But then what Wilson says is that he built an Adobe house after that. And probably Workman didn't build a Adobe right away because the weather was pretty difficult in terms of making Adobe if it's the rainy season, for example. So it may have been in the summer when he built an Adobe house. And what Wilson says is he resided in it the ensuing winter and has continued to be there ever since. We don't know what that house exactly consisted of. We are going under the premise that it was a 2-room or 3-room Adobe that we still have as part of the house today. But this is all we have from that very early time and description. Now, the next year, William Workman's brother, David, who had just moved from Missouri with his family, was living with his brother on the rancho in the house. David was driving sheep and cattle up to the gold fields. It was still the gold rush era. And on one of these trips, he fell off a cliff while looking for a stray animal and was killed. And so his funeral happened at the end of 1855 in November. And fortunately, the Los Angeles Star, the first paper in the area, covered the funeral. And there was a pretty detailed description of the event, including the fact that when people arrived from Los Angeles to the Workman House, there was a reception in the upper portion. Now that might sound to some people like an upstairs, but it wasn't really a second floor. What the upper portion meant was the northern section of the house. And we know it was single story because of the description that came later on. And then what was said was that the group marched to the opposite end of the house, which would be the southern portion of the building. I'll talk about what that entailed in a moment. And then they entered the room where the corpse was laid out and that sort of thing. So again, it's not really 2 floors. It's just more about the northern as opposed to southern end of the Adobe house. Now we know that because there were other descriptions. So in 1856, for example, there was an artist traveling through California. He was doing drawings of the missions. And he had a plan to paint them and then publish a book. I don't think that ever happened, but he did go through this area in October of 56. And he stopped here at the Workman homestead. And he wrote in a journal that was published later on that Mr. Workman's house is a one-story building. So again, there was never a second story. The upper and lower was more, about the northern and southern part. But what Miller, a guy's name was Henry Miller, what Miller said was, it's a one-story building of Adobe and forms a square with a yard in the middle. Now, what that means is that there was not just a original portion of the building built in the early 1840s, but there had been subsequent additions of rooms on the southern end, connected at the bottom by a gate. So there was a yard in the middle, meaning a courtyard. The house is well finished, he said, and painted with oil colors on the inside and outside to imitate marble, and then it was varnished. We have today, on the exterior of the two porches, a restoration of what was there previously, which was plaster that was then painted and penciled to look like granite. And so Miller may have confused the granite with the marble, but what's interesting is he talks about the inside and outside. And so that's something that we had not known about previously when we first came across this description quite a number of years ago. Now, in 1858, there was an agricultural society that had recently been formed, and a committee was sent out through the state to go look at farms and ranches and talk about what people were growing as part of this agricultural society's work. And in 1858, that committee visited here, and they said that Workman's buildings are of adobe, colored and penciled to represent stone, so matching what had been said by Miller a couple years before. As far as the shape, they described it as an oblong square, which could also be a rectangle, and a court. So again, there was an idea that there was something open in the middle of this. And they gave the dimensions as 75 by 150 feet. So today, the Workman House is roughly 72 feet from west to east. That means then that the adobe core that was built in the early 1840s was probably about 20 feet deep, and you've got another 130 feet of adobe rooms built in two wings to the south. And again, I'll show you a diagram so you can get an idea of what that would have looked like. And then there was another description in 1860 by a man named John Quincy Adams Warren, who was born in Massachusetts, not surprisingly. Warren's father, James, was a prominent horticulturist in San Francisco and had started a journal, a farmer's journal that was published until just several years ago. And so young John Q.A. Warren went through California in 1860 and visited farms and ranches and wrote about it for that journal. And what he says is the main building or residence, that was my misspelling here, the main building or residence is in the form of an oblong square. He used exactly the same wording as in 1858. In fact, it leads me to think that maybe he was part of that committee of that agricultural society that his father had helped form. And in the center is a large open courtyard. So we get some consistency here in terms of the basic shape of this expanded building. And again, I'm going to show you a diagram in just a moment. Now, I also want to bring in the much detailed description of John Harrison Temple, who was a grandson of the Workmans. William and his wife, Nicolaso Urioste, had a son who lived away from the area for many years, and a daughter, Antonia Margarita, who married a young man named F.P.F. Temple in the 1840s. They had a large family of 11 children, 8 who lived to be adults. And number 5 was John. He was born in 1856, just a few months before Miller came out to see the place. Many years later, John, in 1918, wrote out his recollections of the building as he knew it as a young man, as a child, basically. And you'll see, he says, if you can read this, that the house was 75 by 150 feet. So that matches what the other descriptions were. Maybe he had seen those himself. Adobe walls 3 feet thick. The northern part consisted of 3 immense rooms. So these would be the early portions of the building in the 1840s. Again, whether they were all built together or not is a question, but these were the original rooms. The eastern room was used by the family. The middle was a dining room, maybe also a living room. The west room, a reserve room, which we would take to be a guest room, something like that. Then the southern part of the building, he says, consisted of 2 parallel wings. He says 75 feet long, which cannot be the case, because if it was 150 feet in that direction, you can see that it wouldn't be 75 feet, because that Adobe core that he talks about as the northern part was only about 20, making the length of the building 150 feet. So he's got himself a little bit confused there, evidently. The parallel wings were devoted to various uses, and he goes through and talks about what these were. So on the east side, there was a smoking and restroom. And restroom does not mean bathroom, it just means a place to go relax. There was a fireplace there, for example. Next to that was the well room. The water well had been outside. I'll show you some pictures of that in a moment. And it was enclosed when these wings were built of Adobe. And again, we don't know when these wings were constructed. It was, I would guess, probably in the early 1850s, when the gold rush was allowing the family to accumulate enough wealth to be able to expand their house. Next to the well room, you have a commissary, which is basically a ranch store where you would have material for the ranch workers, butcher shop, and a blacksmith shop. So you've got work areas attached to the house. This is not uncommon. A lot of buildings had this. For example, down in Long Beach, Rancho Los Cerritos, which is owned by Jonathan Temple, half-brother of the workman's son-in-law, he had a 2-story Adobe main core, and then he built wings off that to the west facing the Los Angeles River, and similar things. You would have work areas attached to the main house in these wings. On the west side, he talks about a sitting or reception room next to that reserve room that was part of the original Adobe core, where he would receive those having business with him, sort of like an office maybe. The kitchen was underneath this room. That's something I'm going to bring up in a moment too, as far as the very unusual circumstance of having a basement in an Adobe house here in California. Next to the sitting room was the school room. So John and his older siblings, and also probably some of the younger ones, received their early education in the house. Public schools were not to be found way out here in the eastern San Gabriel Valley back then. So the children were educated by a tutor that the Workmans had living with them. In fact, I believe he talked about other things that were done in terms of education, not just being reading, writing, and arithmetic, but maybe how to behave and use etiquette and that sort of thing. The other rooms on this west wing would be a place to store saddles, the saddle trees to hang those from or to store those on, things that would be used by vaqueros or cowboys, and storing grain. So again, work areas at the southern end of these wings. What we did some years ago internally, just to kind of get a sense of how the house was developing, but it wound up being a useful tool for our tours and other programs, is we created this diagram. This is just one part of it. I'll show you the other part in a moment. And so what we did was to use descriptions like John Harrison's, especially, to kind of get an idea of what was involved, putting in room measurements, but also trying to identify what the walls were constructed of, and to also account for the different thicknesses. So this is the center core that we would say was built in the early 1840s, that John Harrison mentions as the northern part, the 3 room. So we identified, based on his description, the east side being for William and his family. And how many of it, well, whether both kids were there all that often or not is a question, because the son, for example, was sent back to the East Coast to go to school at a fairly young age. He might have been here for a short period of time. In the center, he called this the dining room, and we assume also probably a living room, at least at some point. The reserve room being on this west side. When the brother, David, brought his wife and 3 sons out, we're assuming that they lived there for about the year or so that they were on the property. And then there would be changes over time. So for example, we know that there is, because we have it today, there is an Adobe room attached here on the east side. So this would be the northeast part of the building. The walls are not as thick. They also are not joined to this wall. They abut against it. So that tells us that it was built separately. And we had wondered for a long time, because there's not one corresponding on this side. This room today is a brick room from about 1870. But we had gone underneath in the crawl spaces, and some of us got to crawl through there and take a look at this many years ago. I'm not sure I would be able to do that now as easily, but there are Adobe footings about halfway through. So if you go in the crawl space, there are these little remnants of a wall there, and it corresponds to the wall over on this side. So we know that there were actually 2 Adobe rooms built on the north end of the house at one point. We still have one, we don't have the other. And that happens with older houses, obviously. Now let's go to the second part of this drawing. And so I've cut off the top where we had those three rooms. And then we get to the wings that John Harrison talked about, and the oblong square in which was a courtyard mentioned by Miller, Warren, and the Agricultural Society. So again, we could go through and add these descriptions of the smoking room, for example, from the 1850s that John mentioned. The well, which was outside, just next to the original core, was enclosed. And now it's actually in a brick room that was built about 1870, but at one point there was an Adobe room there. And the wings just continue to extend to the south. Again, the commissary, the butcher shop, the blacksmith shop. The dotted lines are because we don't have those spaces anymore, because the workmen's renovated their house one more time, about 1870. Again, on the west side, you would have had a sitting or meeting room where workmen met those conducting business with them, as John Harrison talked about, and then the schoolroom, the saddle storage, and the grain storage being to these southern portions. Now, the other descriptions, and I didn't go into this in any detail at all, but it was mentioned by the Agricultural Society and by Warren, as well as John H. Temple, was that there was a gate here at the southern end, and there was what one source called an elaborate apartment. And the word apartment would mean like a living space for people, but what it actually was, according to John H. Temple, was a pigeon house. So they kept these birds up there for food. And that would be, again, at the southern end. There was also mention in an early description of a trellis of grapevines running the length of the courtyard. We do have a grapevine trellis today. There is a vine on there just about here that is pretty old. So we're not sure, but it might have gone back as far as the Workman era. And descriptions also mentioned in the courtyard, the tropical fruits, orange trees, that sort of thing. So we're providing for that in this layout as well. And this legend in the bottom, we identified the different building materials used in these spaces and also the time period. So it's color coded. So we can be able to, again, identify when things were done at various times. I didn't mention it before, but we did add to this that there were other time periods when things were being utilized. So especially 1870, when the main renovation was done by the workmen's. And that involves not just adding rooms to the four corners, here the two corners on the north, for example, but it meant tearing down these wings that extended 150 feet or so and building new brick rooms on the corner. So for example, the well room had been an Adobe space. That Adobe was torn out, and there is a brick room there now. Interestingly, there is a little space to the north of that that had a kitchen, probably built in the 1940s. The eastern wall was made of Adobe. The west wall, which faces the porch, was not. It was made out of wood frame and that sort of thing. So even some of these rooms that had Adobe elements to it from way back were changed over time. That's the basic point of that. So there's a couple of views of that well. We have a room today where we store a lot of our materials for our events. There's a trap door and it's got a grate on it. And then we had some people through the City of Industry put in a button for a light. So every time we open that door up, the light goes on. And then of course, like the refrigerator, and then when it gets closed, it turns it off. But you can get a nice view with the light of this well, which is about 30 or so feet deep. You can see it's cobble lined. So somebody had to dig this out and then place all of those stones in there to structurally support it. At the top, there is red brick because when rooms were built over the well, they had to build this brick up to get to the level of the floor in the room that we're talking about. So again, that 1870 remodeling for the brick room that's there now, I would assume that's when this brick was laid in. That well dried up a long time ago as more and more uses happened with the house, and a second well was drilled not too far away, just to the south. We have a water tower and a pump house out there where that second well, which is also dried up, was located. Now, what happened in the 1870 renovation? And it's good to bring in some context here. By that point, William and his wife were in their late 60s. They had been very successful ranchers and farmers. The ranching part with cattle really mostly went by the wayside after floods and droughts in the early to mid 1860s. The family was able to transition over to agriculture. They had been doing that already, but they just put more emphasis into that. Wheat, as John Harrison mentioned, with the grain storage, vineyards to make wine, that sort of thing. But also, very importantly, That land claims process I had mentioned before, where they had to present evidence to a commission, and the goal was to get a patent from the federal government that would certify that they owned their land. That didn't happen for 15 years. They started in 1852 and they got their patent in 1867. So two things happened. One is Workman and Rowland, being elderly gentlemen by this point, decided they would officially partition the ranch exactly in half by different types of land. And I think that led Workman to decide, now is the time for me to go ahead and do a major renovation of the house, because I've got federal patent for this property. He was also, by 1870, moving into the business world through his son-in-law, his daughter's husband, F.P.F. Temple. For example, they opened the second bank in Los Angeles. That was in 1868 with a guy named Isaiah Hellman, who later ran Wells Fargo, and these guys should have stayed with him. They split up in 1871, and there was a bank called Temple and Workman. So he is a banker now, and maybe the house is going to reflect his new status as a major business figure. According to some sources, Workman and his son-in-law were the two wealthiest individuals in Los Angeles County about the time the house was renovated in 1870. This is a drawing that was done for a map that William had made of part of his ranch in October 1870, at which time, by the way, he also did his will. So he's putting a lot of stuff together all at one time. If the house had not yet been completed, I don't think it would have been shown on the map, although it's possible that there was still work being done. But anyway, it does show what transpired with this house. It went from an I shape in the 1840s to a U shape in the 1850s and 60s to what would be an H, the center core of Adobe with the four projecting wings on both sides to give you that H shape. Well, let me go back. I should have mentioned a couple things. One is that the house is attributed to have been overseen by the first professional architect in Los Angeles, Ezra Franklin Kaiser, who came to town just before 1870. He did a number of buildings in his years as a practicing architect. Some are still there. The Pico House Hotel, for example, just off Alveda Street, St. Vibiana's Cathedral. There's a building at Heritage Square in the Highland Park area that was done by Kaiser, the Perry Mansion. And they all pretty much share some similarities in terms of style, use of Italianate architectural details, for example. So there might be some columns with Greek capitals on it, arched windows. There's some Gothic that you might see on some of these buildings. In the case of the Workman House, the corners have stucco coins, large blocks on them. The steeply pitched roof would be another example of that. Greek Revival would be those columns I just mentioned. So it's a hodgepodge or a mixture of styles that were popular at the time. Some people call that picturesque because there's no one style associated with it. It's a mixture. But when you go to, if you go to see the Pico House Hotel, for example, and then look at the Workman House, you can see definitely the same kinds of pedigrees there that Kaiser brought into it. Unfortunately, we just have little existing evidence of virtually anything with this renovation. There are some references to building materials being sent out in 1870, fencing, that sort of thing. But there aren't letters, there aren't journals, there aren't blueprints that we know of that have survived. So that's part of the problem. And even the newspapers didn't really talk about this house at all that we've been able to find so far. What we do know is, again, those adobe wings were removed, brick rooms on the corners, and a second floor, very importantly, being built at that time. The basement was also expanded. I'm going to share some photos in a minute of that. And I made some reference to some of the decorative elements. So really a pretty extreme makeover, if you want to call it that, of the Workman House by 1870. Now that basement is a highly unusual feature. I don't know of any other Adobe homes that had them. And we know that there is at least one part that is underneath that historic core of the building. This is the photo here in the upper right shows that. The living room, dining room is above that. So these are the beams to support the floors for that, the joists and so forth. But it is a room that has adobe walls. They were plastered at some point. There's still remnants of that there. It has dirt floors. And I'll talk about toward the end, they even took out some of the dirt here and cored down to look at the underlying part of this, what the foundation for this is. So to have a basement going back that far is just really unusual. And it has been said that there was storage of wine there, for example, and who knows what else was being stored there. But there was expansion over time. So here on the left, this is a long hallway that is under the porch and one of the brick rooms. So where the photographer, which is me, stood, is underneath a brick portion of the house, built in 1870. And you can even see here on the left, there is red brick that has been plastered. So that is indicative of an addition being made beyond what would have been the basement, maybe just under the porch down in this direction. See the fire extinguisher hanging here just past that. The room I just showed you here on the upper right, that would be off to the left, just about here. And then the other end of the house, so I'm looking west to east here. Again, that may have been expanded around 1870. So they had to have a way to get down to that little room that was underneath the living room. And so probably on the porch, there was a staircase going down. And as they expanded over here to the right, you can see a little bit actually the staircase that is there today. And the wall next to it is also red brick. So again, that tells us that the staircase was not there earlier, that there was some other way for them to get down to the basement. Just fascinating to think about how these houses change over time.
Paul, we've got a question.
Absolutely.
What's the ceiling height?
The ceiling height in the basement?
Yes.
I would say probably about 8 feet. Yeah, I'm guessing about 8. It might be a little higher than that, but yeah, probably around 8 feet. So as I'm looking west to east on this photograph here, there's an opening to the side, and that leads to another space that again is underneath the brick room. So where I'm standing in this photograph is the north end of that room, and then to the right or to the south is under that same space. And you can see the venting here. What's interesting is the floor is actually inlaid with brick in a herringbone pattern. So it wasn't just dirt or even just bricks sort of laid out evenly. It's in a herringbone for some reason. This is the space described by John Harrison Temple, and I had it on that outline earlier, that layout. This is the kitchen. So they probably had an outdoor ramada or outdoor kitchen that would be in the courtyard somewhere. And then they decided by 1870 to put the kitchen down here. And you've got plenty of ventilation with those spaces here, as you can see on the south there and on the west on this side. So another fascinating thing, I don't know if any other Adobe homes of that era or homes period would have had a kitchen quite like this one. It really sets this house apart. Now, as I said, there was also a second floor built in this 1870 renovation, and it was, so far as we know, completely unfinished at that time. This is the main portion of the attic, again, looking from west to east. What we did several years ago was we reinforced the floors and added handrails. So for our behind the scenes tours that we did in person, we could actually take people down there in small numbers and let them walk through and kind of see the space here. And so again, as I said, as far as we know, unfinished in 1870. The Workmans are approaching 70, their kids are long gone. There really wasn't a reason to have more room necessarily. And so the attic may have just been a place to store things. And then I'll show you a photo in a minute where they had an interesting little element with these little beams up here on the top. Later on, though, there were things done in these spaces. So this is a room that is at the southeast portion of the building. There were floors laid in. The windows may have been there from the Workman period of time, but even here where you have these angled parts of the ceiling, you can see shadowing of plaster that had been nailed to that. So lath and plaster was a common building technique. The lath is kind of the wooden structure, and then you put the plaster over that. And you can see shadows of what had been there and then later removed at some point. So this room was finished. To what degree, we do not know. And there was a door put in as well. That door may not have been there when the Workmans did their 1870 renovation, but certainly at a later date, perhaps the 1890s is our best guess. Some work was done to expand that. And that's because the John Harrison Temple I mentioned before, who did the detailed description, he himself owned the house from about 1888 to roughly 1900. He had several children and other family members who, there may have been guests staying there. People may have been living there at some point upstairs in the Workman House. So this upper left shows you one of these very thin boards that goes across as part of the main roof structure. They're multi-gabled. You can see it here in this room, but you get the way the roof has got multiple angles on it. These are square head nails. Those are pretty easy to date because these were not really manufactured after 1900. They had gone to the round nails that were really just mass produced. It's not certain whether these were handmade, although a lot of these square head nails were up to a point because they hadn't gotten to the industrial technology to do mass production. But what's really interesting is there's still twine hanging from this nail. And there's a couple other spaces within that, because it's not just this one board, there are several that have these nails on them. And that leads us to think that they dried things up there, peppers, grapes, that sort of thing. It's very hot in this attic during the summertime. As those of us who've been around long enough and been up there know, it can be easily in the 90 degrees plus up there in the summer. So it'd be ideal space to do drying of various things, which is kind of a cool little remnant we have still up there today. In more recent years, there were other changes made to the second floor. For example, about 1940, a family bought the property, which was about 90 acres, to establish a sanitarium called El Encanto. It's still there today. They call themselves a Rehabilitation and Healthcare Center. But this was a room on the northwest portion of the second floor, built for one of the three sons of the Brown family. That would be this room here off to the right side of the photo on the bottom left. There's a middle room that one of the sons occupied, and then to the left, out of camera view, is on the south end, a third bedroom. And there's even a bathroom that was installed just off to the camera here on to the right. So over time, as houses do, lots of changes were made, rooms were added and so forth. And we, within the last 5 or 6 years, went in and redid some of this and cleaned it up, put the doors back on, patched holes, that sort of thing, to make it more presentable when we do our behind the scenes tours.
Paul,
So this is the earliest photograph of the Workman House.
Paul, can I break in to ask a
Yes, of course
question
you
real
can.
quick? The two doors in the picture, if you go back, the doors are a different design, different time frame. So they're wondering if the doors date to different periods of time.
Yeah, very well could be. Yes, absolutely. This one here looks more like the earlier period because we have other doors from that. So in fact, when the site was restored in the 1970s, they took all of these doors off, numbered them, and put them in the basement. In fact, they were in that early room that I showed you. You might remember there were a couple of doors laying on some pieces of wood. So our supposition is that when this was all done in 1940, they had doors made that would look somewhat old, but they were a different style. So that was a pretty sharp eye somebody caught with that there's these two different styles. Now, that doesn't mean that this little closet here wasn't done in 1940 either. So it's a little hard to know for sure when some of these things were done. But I think remembering talking to one of our staff that was felt like this was a newer door because it was lighter. It didn't have the solid wood construction you might have with an older door, for example. Okay, so this is earliest known photo, probably the very early 1870s. There is a signature on the bottom. It says Godfrey Photo. William M. Godfrey was one of the first photographers in Los Angeles. And so we've seen his work around. We've got probably about a dozen of his photographs in our collection. So that was helpful in terms of the dating part of it. As far as we know, this would be William Workman here standing on the porch. This is the north side of the home, the formal front entrance. And I say formal because there was a southern entrance. So it's probably more everyday use. There are a couple of women standing here. I'd love to believe one of them is his wife, Nicolasa. We have no known photographs of her. One may be their daughter. But they could also be people who were working in the household. They're both holding small infants. There's a little boy here, Walter P. Temple, who wound up owning the homestead in the 19-teens to early 1930s, was born in 1869. He looks about that age. That could be him. There's a couple of gentlemen standing off to the side. One might be the ranch foreman. Another could be the son-in-law. Maybe Workman's daughter's here. We just don't know because people didn't identify who the folks in the photograph are, which is always a reminder to us to label our photographs for people in the future to know who are in these images. But it is great because you can see some of the architectural details. Like I said, these quoins indicative of Gothic style, like the steeply pitched roof, the columns and the capitals and the windows, and more of the Greek revival. The Italian, it could be the arches and the decorations there. As well as these brackets in the roof. So it's interesting to see what was being done with the building. One of the cool things as the landscape is concerned is that this Lady Banks rose bush is still with us today. It's purportedly planted in 1860 for the birth of the oldest granddaughter in the family, Lucinda Temple, and still with us. So it's kind of neat to have that. There was a description, by the way, in the 1858 to 1860 period of an enclosed garden with a 7-foot brick wall that was 90 feet square. Now this wall is nowhere near 7 feet. So maybe it had to be replaced because of earthquake or who knows. But this might be the enclosed garden. It doesn't look like it's particularly well cultivated in the sense of a formal garden, but photographs can be a little bit deceiving, but you can see obviously some plants in there. So there were some descriptions about the landscape as well as just the house in those earlier versions I mentioned to you. And if you've got a good eye, you can see way in the back, first of all, stairs going up to the east side of the Workman House, but back there is a pretty typical barn. And there was a road coming down from Valley Boulevard, which was the main road back then, often known as the County Road or the Colorado Road, because it was part of the system to take you to the Colorado at Yuma. And people would probably go to the back of the Workman House to park their horse and buggy and that sort of thing, and then walk up to the building, maybe from the south end. So whether the formal front entrance was used all that much, who knows? As far as we know, though, there wasn't too much going on between the mid-1870s and the 1890s. The Workmans and Temples Bank collapsed in 1875. They failed. They had borrowed money from Lucky Baldwin, pretty well-known name in California in those days. And it was devastating. Workman committed suicide as a result of the failure of the bank. And Baldwin sold the Workman House, outbuildings, the cemetery that the family had established in the 1850s, and 75 acres to William Workman's favored grandson, Francis W. Temple. He would be the older brother of the John I mentioned earlier, John Temple. Francis had been a winemaker for his grandfather, and he had been living there and of course, and helping his grandfather out. And he wound up staying after William Workman committed suicide. Francis then bought the house from Baldwin in 1880. The reason why it's such a long gap is because Baldwin waited to foreclose for several years to allow the interest on the loan to accumulate. That, however, gave Francis time to make enough money from the winemaking and whatever else he could do to be able to buy the house. I think he paid several $1,000s for the property, which became known as the La Puente or the Workman homestead from that point onwards. But as far as we know, Francis didn't do too much to the Workman House. What he may have done is built the water tower and drilled the well to the south. And I'll show you a photo next that we can get a little hint of the water tower a little bit later. But again, we're presuming not too many changes here until about 1890. And that's when John himself got the property. Francis had probably tuberculosis. He died just before his 40th birthday. He was not married, no children. So he left the homestead to two brothers. One was named William, who was in Mexico. I think he was in Mexico at that time, and was not in California at any rate. And he sold his interest to John. And I know there's a lot of Temples, sorry for the confusion of the names, but John moved in with his wife, Anita, their two little boys in 1888. And I would imagine this photo was taken very shortly after that. It could have been in 88 or 89, somewhere in that period of time, because we know the ages of the boys. They were born in 87 and 88 themselves, so maybe 1890. In any case, you can see in the back, if you've got sharp eyes, it's a little hard with this right now, but there is a building back here, which is one of the wineries that William Workman built in the 1860s. And then there's a little bit of the roof line of the water tower visible through that. We just unearthed an original photograph of this from a Temple descendant who just passed away. And you can see more clearly those structures in that version of the photograph. This one's probably 3 or 4 generations from that original. So in any case, John does undertake some work. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we believe he's the one who built some rooms here on this eastern end of the house upstairs. I showed you photos of what they look like now. And so that was probably one thing that he was able to do during the 1890s when he was there. Unfortunately for John, he lived in the house in a time where there was a nationwide depression. In 1893, 6 of the 10 years during the 1890s were drought years. So he wound up borrowing money from a bank in Los Angeles, could not pay the loan back, much like his grandfather and father had done with their own financial problems before. And he was foreclosed upon in 1899, and he moved out. The property was then acquired by a guy from Pomona. He lived or owned the place. I don't know if he lived there, but he owned it for about 4 years. Sold it to a gentleman from Anaheim, a guy named Lafayette Lewis, who was infamous for tearing out almost all the cemetery, just desecrating virtually the whole thing before he was stopped by Walter P. Temple, John's younger brother, who would a decade later buy the place himself. And so there was a lot of degradation of the property going on. I would guess that these were probably absentee owners. They may have rented out the place to farmers. And so the property was not necessarily maintained as well as it had been before. So to give you an illustration, this is a photograph that may come from that time period. I have another one that's definitely from about 1905. And so, yeah, you can see, for example, a trellis. So that had been mentioned way back in the 1850s. Again, the fence wouldn't have lasted that long, but whether there were still grapevines that had been growing from early days and were still here at this, circa 1900 time or not is interesting to think about. But there is definitely a big orange tree here that looks like a citrus tree with its dark leaves and that sort of thing. And you can see some landscape. As far as the house, again, it doesn't look like there have been a lot of changes. That staircase you had seen in the 1870s photo with the Workman family on it was gone by this point. There's also a pipe, a flue coming out of the chimney here on this side of the house, which may indicate that there had been a kitchen installed in the upper part of the house rather than the old one in the basement, because obviously as time goes on, people want to have more modernized kitchens. So that's just a guess, but there is definitely some pipe sticking out of this chimney here. So just a few little examples of what could be happening over time. But again, there's a lack of documentation. We don't know a lot about what happened as you get into the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. There was a guy named Henry T. Hazard who had been a mayor of Los Angeles and a lawyer, and he visited the homestead about 1905, somewhere in that period of time. He took photographs which were acquired by a guy out in Santa Monica who then sold or donated them to the Huntington Library. So they're at the Huntington now. And again, this is very first part of the 20th century. These look almost like corn or something like that, like a field crop at the back of the house. A little bit of trellis can be discerned here behind that. Again, maybe citrus tree. You can see pretty clearly in this one, the pipe sticking out of that chimney, again, on the east side. So we've moved from the east side to the west side with this photo. This little structure, and the name has just popped out of my head, gazebo, it shows up in later photographs. It was even there in the 1920s, so it was there for quite a while. What's really kind of cool about this picture is that you can see right in here the original entrance to the basement, or a original entrance to the basement. So when I showed you that photo earlier, looking down that corridor, and I was saying I was standing on the west end, I was standing near where that entrance used to be. There was a door there, and there was an arched support of brick there. Many years later, that was all closed up, and they had another entrance from the porch put in. Now, there may have been two. There may have been a step or stairs going from the porch down there, as well as a door to the side here. So that's kind of a cool little detail you can pick up with some of these old photos we have. This is going back to the north end. You can see debris lying in the foreground. Again, this is the same, 1905 roughly era. The rose bush appears to be in here, but I don't know if it's this one or not, because it looks like there's almost two kinds of plants here, but it had been growing quite a bit. This is touching the house. So you get the impression that there wasn't a lot of maintenance going on. It looks like a lot of weeds in the foreground, that sort of thing. So again, maybe absentee owners and people who are renting the place out and doing farming on the roughly 75 acres that existed. So again, not a lot of detail prior to about 1917, but you get a little bit of visual indications of what was going on or what was not going on. There were owners between 1907 and 1917, father and his son-in-law. And the son-in-law, whose name was Pratt, appears to have lived in the Workman House. So they were the ones, after about a decade of ownership, who sold it in fall of 1917 to Walter P. Temple, who had just come into a tremendous stroke of luck, he and his family, with oil that had been found on their ranch near Montebello. So the Temples moved from the Whittier Narrows area to the homestead over a course of years after they bought the property in 1917. This is an aerial photograph that was taken in the early 20s. And just to give you your bearings, this is looking east to west. This is a street called Turnbull Canyon Road, which locals will know. This is the rail line of what was then the San Pedro, Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad. That sold out to the Union Pacific. And so it's still owned by the Union Pacific today. Metrolink runs their Riverside line on this, for example. This is San Jose Creek, a natural water course, which did have water virtually year round. and was used for irrigation way back in the Workman era. It's been channelized into a flood control channel today, much straighter than it was back then. This is the access road to Valley Boulevard that had always existed under the Workman period, but after the bank failure and the reduction of the homestead to 75 acres, this became the border, the line that I'm tracing down here. You can even see the outline of how the land was being used. So basically the homestead went from, on the west, this Turnbull Canyon Road, on the north here, the south to the creek, and the east would be basically out towards what is now Hacienda Boulevard. The Workman House.
Paul?
Yes.
We've got a question.
Go ahead.
What is growing behind the property? It looks like a grove of trees.
Are we talking about here?
I think so.
Yeah. I was going to get into that. Thank you for asking that question. So let me just mention Workman House, the cemetery that he significantly renovated and improved after he bought the place. You still have the heart-shaped planter here, for example, today. There's a tennis court, reservoir used to irrigate crops, which gets to the question being raised. Also served as a swimming pool. The wineries built in the 1860s by William Workman, still standing. They were used for canning food in the early part of the 1900s. And then Walter P. Temple converted these into a garage, an auditorium, and a cafeteria / dining hall. And yes, these dark green trees were agricultural crops. I'm assuming because of how closely packed these were, that this might have been citrus. Later on, and maybe not long after this photo was taken, walnut trees were planted, but walnuts have to be basically 30 feet apart because they have a wide spread of branches and that sort of thing. So I'm imagining this is probably mostly citrus at this point, and then they expanded to walnuts not too far afterwards. In fact, I think they may have taken a lot of this citrus out and put it to walnuts as well, because that was a big crop. This area had, in fact, La Pointe had the world's largest walnut packing house built right around this time, early 20s.
Paul, another question from Alan is, was there a spring?
As far as water goes, for domestic purposes, we had the well next to the Workman House, and then the second well drilled to the south where the water tower is, late 19th century. There were two other wells that were drilled. I don't know exactly where those were located, but I would imagine one of those probably filled this reservoir here. So I'm guessing that was somewhere out to the east between the Workman House and the cemetery. And there was a second one somewhere else. So yeah, they had artesian wells, not springs, but artesian wells that would dig down pretty deep to tap any kind of underlying water source that would be on the property. Yeah. And again, for irrigation of the crops, they could tap into the creek for quite a bit of that time as well. One other thing I'll mention, since we're on this image here, this is a street called Don Julian Road that we have today. It was extended over time. And it basically runs right in through here today and goes out to Hacienda Boulevard. So that is also what you see here towards the top. Walter Temple did build homes for his two sisters. They lived on this intersection of basically Don Julian and Turnbull Canyon. This road is no longer existing, and they call that Evergreen Lane. That came in from Turnbull, goes down to the cemetery and loops back around. And when Don Julian was built, just to the south of that, it came through this direction. When the Temples bought the homestead at the end of 1917, there was a lease in effect to a Japanese farmer named Yatsuda. It just says K on the document. It could be Kenji or other first names, but we don't know a lot about Yatsuda. There were quite a few Japanese farmers in the La Puente Valley at that time, mostly doing truck farming, fruits and vegetables, that sort of thing. The lease didn't expire till the end of 1918, so the Temples could not do anything on the property until January 1st, 1919. That meant working on the cemetery and also renovating the Workman House. So what they did sometime after 1919 was to install electricity. There was indoor plumbing put in, that sort of thing. So quite modernized. And you can see these are 1920s photos. The boards that were put in with these little exposures down at the bottom on the porch appeared to have been added around that time. This other photo shows, whoops, I'll have to go to the next photo. You can see it here, the arches with these boards. So some things were changed, probably by the Temples. At some point also, ivy was put on the house and allowed to grow on it. And it looks neat, sort of old English, but the problem is that ivy is going to do tremendous damage to the stucco and other materials that you have on the building. So again, an early 1920s photo. Also that Lady Banks rose bush I pointed out earlier was put on a trellis with 4 posts at that time. And we still have a similar type of layout today. Another photo, very similar time period. These are children of, actually grandchildren of Walter Temple's sister. They're posed out front there. Clearer view, so you can see some of the work done on the porch, changes that were made. There is a chicken wire fencing. Some palm trees are put right in front of the rose bush there. And again, you can see some of the ivy growing on it. So what Walter Temple and his family did is they renovated the west side, first floor only, for their use, meaning Mrs. Temple and her kids. Walter built himself a man cave apartment on the second floor of the water tower. So he liked to stay out there. But they occupied just this side of the house, and only really on weekends or on vacations when they came out. The family had a full-time home in Alhambra between the late teens and into the 20s. Again, another view, very similar from that time period, not the exact same time. For example, if you look, these little plants in front are maybe a foot high, and this is maybe a year or two later, and the plants have grown a little bit more. But again, similar look. And you're on a driveway that came down from Valley Boulevard and then branched off, one to the right, one to the left, and one around the Workman House. The garages were in the back behind this to the south. And this is the south end of the home, also from the 20s. One of the really cool things is the use of a solar panel to heat water. And that was for the bathroom in there. So it's a very small panel because all they really needed to do was heat the water. Solar goes back a long ways. There was a company in Monrovia called Day and Night. I think they sold out to Carrier, the air conditioning company later on. But Day and Night existed, and they probably supplied this, I would guess, since they were local. They were really the first viable solar company. In fact, the owner of that company is often credited as being a pioneer of solar technology, and right here in the San Gabriel Valley. Again, a dark leaf tree would indicate to me probably citrus. It looks like there may be grapes on the trellis here, more formal plantings. There's some other details. The porch, the posts appear to have been original from the 1870 period, still there, but there had been rails with balusters completely gone. There had also been a wooden staircase, and the reason why I think it was probably gone was just exposure to sunlight from the south. We have that problem today with the restored ones we have. They just get hammered. So it's probably a practical decision to put in a cement staircase with kind of a low sidewall on it. So that would be more of a practical consideration given how much damage there would be. Other great photos from the 20s, just to show you what we have with the collection. Here's a Lady Banks rose bush, for example, in the north end. You can see more of that, the wood boards. They had potted plants up there, more of the ivy growing, just kind of fun images of the 20s period of time. Unfortunately, the Temples were really aggressive in oil and real estate projects during the booming period of the Roaring 20s, and they got into financial trouble within several years of buying the property here. It wasn't just the work with the Workman House or the cemetery, it was the building of La Casa Nueva, the 11,000 roughly square foot Spanish colonial revival mansion that the Temples built next to the Workman House. They were doing a lot of spending. They had oil revenue from those wells that brought them their initial wealth over at Montebello, but production really steeply declined there over time as he is spending more money on other projects, whether it's office buildings or post offices, movie theaters, and oil projects. So income is dropping, expenses are rising, and he even took out bonds to try to finance some of his business projects because he was getting in over his head. And by the end of the 1920s, when the stock market crashed, and he was not a stock market investor in a big way, but it was just the timing of it, he was basically wiped out by the time the Great Depression came along. What then happened is that in order to try to save the homestead if he could, Walter leased out the homestead to a military school. It's called Golden State initially. It was in Redondo Beach, and it moved onto the property in 1930 for the 30-31 school year. What they did is they converted the Workman House into classrooms. So partitions were put up to divide some of the spaces, particularly in the center of the house. And then they could use these various rooms, probably on the first floor only, for classrooms for some of the students. What's neat is you can see a greenhouse back here. I think the Temples actually built that. We have very few photos that show that. Back in the courtyard, tennis court to the east of the house, the large reservoir and swimming pool. But this becomes institutional. as of 1930. Temple was hoping he could make enough money from leasing out the homestead, and maybe there would be an oil discovery on one of his other properties. Some miracle was going to happen. It did not happen. And in 1932, as banks were failing all across the United States and the Depression really got bad, the bank that held a mortgage on the homestead foreclosed. So it was lost to the bank. The school stayed for a few more years. They left in 1935. And there was a 5-year period where the property was not really being utilized. There were caretakers who were living on the property. Actually, they were living in La Casa Nueva, the Temple home next door. But in the last half of the 30s, there wasn't really any use of the homestead to speak of. And that led to the buying of the property in the fall of 40 by Harry and Lois Brown, who were in Monrovia. They wanted to start a sanitarium, as they were called in those days, and they found the ideal place. So they came out, established El Encanto, as it is still known. The Workman House was converted. Initially, as I think I mentioned earlier, the family lived in it. And what you can see here on the top is a dormer that was installed to provide light for the bathroom. And then the 3 sons lived in this wing of the second floor. I remember one of them telling me, since passed away, that it was miserable in the summer. They had to open all the windows in the morning and just try to get whatever cool air they could into the structure. But without air conditioning back then, it was not the most ideal place to stay. The Browns then wound up moving off-site. In fact, one little detail is the Brown sons, the 3 of them, had actually gone to the military school in the early 30s, and they had forgotten that when they came out to see the place. They didn't remember that this had been the same place, but they wound up owning it. And then this was the offices for the hospital, as well as the nurses' station. So the main office was on the east side here, and then the nurses had their various locations elsewhere in the building. Again, off to the left here, bottom left corner, is the tennis court I showed you earlier. And this is probably an early 1940s photo. What happened then is that El Encanto had to move because the state had modernization requirements, and this was not considered up to code for a healthcare facility. So they had to build a new facility to the north of the Workman House in La Casa Nueva. And that was done over several years in the middle 1960s, middle to late 60s. The City of Industry had formed, meanwhile, in the late 50s. There had been an interest in the historic buildings. And so they bought the Workman House, the City of Industry did, in 1963. There was a provision that the Browns could allow public access for appointment-only tours. We're not sure how much of that was done, but that was in the 60s. Now, the other home, La Casa Nueva, was not purchased until the mid-70s. So it was a long period of time where it was basically just the Workman House and the cemetery as well that the city owned, but the rest of the property was still held by the Browns. These are photos from the 60s when members of the Temple family came to visit. So this woman here is Edith Temple Stanton. She was born in 1891, so her father, John, had owned the house at that time, and he had been the one who did all those descriptions way back of what the house looked like. And so she came to see the place in the late 60s. You can see all the ivy growing all over the place. This is, again, that Lady Banks rose bush that had extended in its growth to the house and was growing on the roof and causing quite a few problems. You can see a little bit of that right here, too. Well, even better is this one on the lower left. Yes.
We've got a question, just a clarification on what type of facility El Encanto was. Alan asks, was it mental or physical sanitarium?
It was both. It was mostly for people who had what we would call basically Alzheimer's or dementia. And that's what it mostly did. But over time, it began to diversify. And so it took other kinds of patients, including people who were rehabbing from injury and that sort of thing. But it was really for older people who had cognitive issues, dementia, Alzheimer's. That was the original use of it. So this photo on the left here shows Edith Stanton later on with Walter P. Temple Jr., whose father had owned the homestead in the teens and 20s, and his wife, Nellie. And they're sitting underneath this massive arbor. So you can see how extensive the rose bush had grown onto the house, which again would cause a lot of problems for the roof and that sort of thing. So it was cut back, and today we keep it quite a bit removed from the house. When the City of Industry finally purchased La Casa Nueva and decided as part of the American Bicentennial that it would restore the homestead, it decided that the Workman House would only be restored on the exterior, and a lot of work had to be done. You can just get some indications from some of these photos here where they had to remove the old plaster and stucco and redo that. Lots of doors and windows had to be replaced and other details. Porches had to be redone. The south porch, for example, had been converted to rooms. So it had a dining room and others that the Browns had used when they had been living there. So quite a bit had to be done to the building. They did renovate that penciled and painted granite wall that was mentioned as far back as the mid-1850s. They left some frame portions of the original wall. Unfortunately, they gouged it by taking pieces out of it for the new plaster to stick onto the old. Then they realized they should save some of it, so they framed in some of those pieces that had already been damaged. But at least you can see some of those today on both sides. This is the north porch, and you can see some of the restoration people working on renovating that. We've had ongoing work with that over the years too. It takes some work to maintain that, obviously. And again, just this whole south porch had to be redone, and they went and remade columns and balusters like you would see in the 1870s photographs. A new door to the basement was put in, new staircase, but because there had been a brick wall there, it was pretty obvious there had been some kind of staircase there before, and maybe some of our 1920s photographs give you hints of that. But a lot of work done to just replicate or repair, refinish, that sort of thing. You can see how much work had been done as they progressed just within these several photographs that I've showed you. I've got a few more here as well. This door on the north porch was not there when the Workman family lived in the house. It was not even there until 1940 or afterwards. The Brown family put that in. But it has a door with the panels that make it look like an older one. So whether they recycled a door from somewhere else or had one made to make it look like an old one, that's an interesting question. But in any case, you can see how extensively this had to be done. Part of the problem too was the east wall of Adobe collapsed. It was known to have been bowing. And you can see from the background in this upper left photograph, there was a big rainstorm at that time. There was a pretty heavy winter rainfall in 1977, 78. Some of us might remember that. I think 30 plus inches fell in our region that year. So it was a bad time to take off the stucco that was probably holding that wall up. They just literally went home and didn't prop it up. And when they came back the next day, they just found the whole thing had toppled over. So what they did is they did CMU, concrete block, as the main wall. And then they put Adobe bricks cut in half on the inside so that when you were on the inside in the future, when they were going to have that available, people could think it was an Adobe wall. It's kind of a clever way to try to get stability and yet make it look like an Adobe wall. But a lot of those bricks that had been on the second floor addition from 1870 were salvaged and reused and reinstalled. So it was Adobe and brick actually that collapsed as part of that. And again, just other photographs showing some of the work that was being done during the restoration years. All right, in the remaining time I have, I want to go through the subsequent years because, as I said, there was just the exterior restoration done. We talked a lot over the years. I've been at the homestead for 33 years, so I was there just within 7 years of opening. And it was always talk about, oh, someday we'll restore the house on the inside like you would see at La Casa Nueva or other buildings where you'd have period furniture and wallpaper and paint and all that sort of thing. It just became increasingly obvious over time that that was going to be extremely expensive and time consuming to do. Although when we did a staff report in the early 90s, that was still the operating principle, was that there would be a full restoration of the house. In 2000, we got a grant from the Getty Grant Program, part of the Getty Museum. And one of the great things they do is provide grant funding for lots of projects like this. And that allowed us to do a lot of analysis of paint and wallpaper, bring some archaeologists out to look at Adobe, for example, and other details of the construction, document the house with professional photography, and even have drawings done for future seismic stabilization, which we're waiting to do. After that, we decided to bring back those archaeologists a couple of times, maybe 3 times. 2004, they went out in the courtyard to see if they could find evidence of those wings. Unfortunately, they could not. It appears that those wing rooms were built directly on the ground. They didn't find any foundations. We did find a few things like an old well site and Native American artifacts, that sort of thing. In 2008, there was another study done where they went in the attic, basement, and crawl spaces. They did core samples of Adobe to determine when those were done, what kind of pollen you would find and plant material in there. It was really fascinating what they came up with as far as some of their findings. But these investigations often revealed more questions than answers, which may not be surprising for a building of this age. We also brought back the guy who did the original paint and wallpaper analysis. His name was Martin Weil, and I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but it's fascinating just to get a hint of what is involved. For example, finding that woodwork would be typical of a certain time period because of the type of wood, the type of paint varnish combination you have. Faux graining, which is basically you're trying to mimic wood graining on another kind of wood. And they had faux granite on the outside and inside of the building at one point, as we heard earlier. Going to the second floor, looking at the sample finishes there that go back maybe to the 1850s and 60s, which is really interesting too, as far as time period is concerned. Problem with looking at the walls, because they get changed a lot. Paint and wallpaper are put on all the time. You scrape off plaster and put new layers on. So that was a little tougher to be able to date than you would be able to do on, say, wood trim, for example. But he did find certain paint colors where you could say, okay, the crimson was calcimine, which is a certain type of paint really used only in the first couple decades of the 1900s and not after that. And then other paint colors will be more popular at certain time periods. So he determined that a yellow and a green that he found in certain areas would be more likely to be from the 20s. So these are just really basic information, so you get an idea of what is involved with some of these analysis. One thing I can tell you that Martin would tell us is that, not surprisingly, there's just a lot that you don't know because so much has been stripped off and redone at various periods of time. So it's like taking a baseboard apart to go behind that, or going into the top of a closet. One of our colleagues that Alex and I worked with for many years made a great discovery of wallpaper at the top of a little closet under the stairs that had not been noticed before. And that turned out to be a very early discovery of perhaps the 1850s or 60s. Going into the crawl space and basement and looking at the Adobe bricks. So just to give you, again, some really basic ideas. Bricks were consistent in those three core rooms that we believe, what we know are the earliest ones from the 1840s, but they could not determine if they were built together. Sometimes you find a cold joint where the walls are not joined together, they abut one another, which means they were not built at the same time. Wall thickness also matters. The center room is 3 inches thick. The adjoining rooms are 2.5. Did they start with the center room and live in that first and just built the other two? Also, one of the rooms on the east side has a ramp that goes down from the center room. It's not built at the same level. So that would be indicative of a different time period. They may have been built in close proximity, maybe within a year or two of each other, but not necessarily together. What the archaeologist came up with was a great little sentence here about the Workman House being a riddle wrapped in a puzzle. And this is just a problem you have when you're looking at old buildings. You're not always going to get the answers that you're hoping to get. And as I said before, when they went to the courtyard in 2004, they could not find footings or any other evidence of the wing rooms. So that was just one of those things where you hoped you would find something and you didn't, but it just maybe meant they built directly in the ground. Other things that, just to point out that are kind of fun too about the study in the attic is that we had bedrooms at the east end that I mentioned before may have been from the 1890s, and a sitting room in the center. I think I'll show you a photo later on where there's windows in the interior of the attic, not facing the outside, but in the middle. And it's kind of a bizarre thing. And they thought maybe that was for light and air because they would have closed all that off with, plaster walls and that sort of thing. And having these windows was a way to get ventilation in an east to west direction because you could open the windows on the east end and west end to get airflow through. They could find things like the fact that plaster had animal hair in the glue. That would be 19th century, not into the 20th. That was kind of a neat thing to find. These floors had asphalt poured on it. And we didn't know if it was part of the original roof of the building or not. They determined it was not. They just poured the asphalt on there later to keep water, dust, and dirt from settling into the first floor from above. And even a cool little thing like finding concealed shoes under floorboards upstairs in the attic on the northeast part of the house. 5 shoes that did not match. And the best guess we could determine from doing research later is that it was kind of like a good luck thing. You wear your shoes until you can't wear them anymore, you repair them. And then to say, this is my space, I'll put some shoes underneath the floorboards. And then we find them, who knows, 120, 130 years later. That was one of the more interesting things we found in the course of doing work over the years. This photo is also very interesting because it shows you 2 levels of flooring. One has asphalt on it, meaning it's earlier, and obviously it's earlier because it's below, but having the asphalt does that too. And then a new floor put over the top. Maybe the older floor was considered to be not as high quality and they thought they would do that. It's hard to say. But even below that, there was a joist that is beaded. And beaded is something you do for decorative purposes. Why was it beaded if it's going to be underneath the floor? That was one of those mysteries we found out. We also found, the archaeologists did, that some of the beams were cut at the ends, which would indicate that maybe the house extended further at one point, and they cut the beams back to move the wall in closer than it had been at one point. So just really interesting things that you find in the course of this work. This is a good example of that. This is a joist that was sawed off. It used to extend further in this direction because presumably the west wall of the house went further out than was done, say, in 1870 when they decided to redo the building. They probably cut that wall and took the wall down, cut the joist, and moved the wall back with a new one. Really, really interesting stuff. This is a remnant of a shingled roof that existed prior to 1870 when this very steep roof structure was done. So we could surmise that before 1870 was a one-story house. They did have a gabled roof with some kind of a little attic, but it was, this little fragment was left there. They didn't take it out, and they just went ahead and put the new structure, new meaning 1870, on there. So all kinds of interesting things we were able to find out as part of the way the house was being done over time. Those shoes, by the way, were found in here. We had an electrician who was doing work to install lights below. This was 2007 maybe, or 2010. It wasn't that long ago. The lights were modern lights, obviously for future uses of the house. And he reached in here to trace wiring that was existing, and he thought he had found some dead rats. And they were these 5 shoes that were laid in, some were right around here, before obviously they laid the floors in. So just kind of a fun little detail. In the basement, I'll mention a couple of things. This is an example of where you can see where cobblestones were used as a foundation and then Adobe bricks laid over the top of that. This is in the southeast corner of the house. So this may have been done for the building of one of the wings. So where Workman had his smoking and rest room, for example. This would be that location. And you see indications of that today. The little well is just behind that, back in the back here. There was some speculation about, using thinner walls in various parts of the house as opposed to thicker double walls, because you could use lumber as time went on, that sort of thing, to shore up walls. Where in the 1840s, you didn't have any lumber, but maybe in the 1850s and 60s, you could, because they had milled lumber used to support walls, and the walls could be thinner than they would be earlier on. Lots of details like that. Here's a little photo I mentioned before, where in that old basement of the house, they went and cored, dug out a space, and they could see what was underneath ground level. So there were Adobe bricks as a foundation for more Adobe on top, not cobble. So that was a little bit of a surprise to find that as we were going through. And again, they could just find that by looking at the Adobe construction, the kind of plant material there was, which would be a time of year. So if you have certain types of plant material that would be growing in the spring and it's in the Adobe brick, you would know that that was probably built in the summer, that sort of thing. But there's just different aspects of when rooms were being built as part of that kind of analysis. It's complicated, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail about it, but it's certainly interesting how they can look at pollen and plant material to determine time of year for when these were being done. In the last 10 years, 15 years, we've spent some time doing what we call a renovation. A full restoration was not possible. It was not going to happen. We just knew that in terms of money and time, trying to find materials, it was just prohibitive to do. So the decision was made to do a renovation, and there was a lot of work to be done. This is a 1930s partition from the military school that had to be taken out. That was actually fairly simple. It wasn't too complex. There was a bathroom next to that was removed, but we found a lot of damage to the floors in that area. So this partition on this photo on the left is basically right in here as I'm running across the photo on the right. And they had to take up all the floors and do a lot of work to get that fixed up and shored up, because we're concerned about damage over time as people were walking through. People didn't have access to this corner where the guy's standing before, but they were going to as we had our renovation done. So we had to do the floorboards work. A lot of spaces just had to be gutted and redone. This was a kitchen from the 1940s. It had blue paint on it. We took the cabinets out, redid the whole space. Really had to make a lot of changes there. This room on the bottom, we called this the graveyard. Our old computers were stored there, and broken piñatas and all kinds of stuff. There was steel shelving in here. There had been a little closet in this corner. All of that torn out. The two cool things we knew we had was the old marble fireplace from about 1870 and this plaster cartouche in the ceiling, the only one that survives from that period of time. But we thought we would just do a basic renovation like the rest of the house looked like. I'll show you the next photograph where you can see what we decided to do, which is basically more like a full restoration. So for example, this is more typical of what we did throughout the house. Basic plaster work, painted, got some light fixtures that looked like gas fixtures in there, but not a restoration by any means. But here is that room I just showed you, the old graveyard. We actually were able to find samples of some stenciling that had been done on the walls, and the artists who did the work on the cartouche here, repainted it, did the walls, gave us a kind of a nice discount on that. We had reproduction drapery brought in. The furniture had been in the collection since the 1980s. It had been in the house back in the 19th century. So we were able to basically recreate at least one room as a restored room. This is upstairs, by the way, when we redid a lot of that area up there. So we had most of the work really was done by the summer of 2015. We decided to redo our tours as part of that because we were obviously able to do more at the Workman House. And so we have been able to show a lot more of the building than we used to. When I started, it was basically one little room in the center of the house, maybe two. And now we get to show people a lot more of the building. And the behind the scenes tours do even more than that. So with that, I'm going to end it and just thank you all for joining us today. And to learn more about what we do, especially during this virtual period during the pandemic, we have a website here, homesteadmuseum.org. We've got a very active blog, homesteadmuseum.blog. Virtually every day, posts are made there. And we are also pretty active on social media. So you can follow us at Homestead Museum on these platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Alex. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. I learned some new things too today, which is great. It's always more to learn as we see. We have see if we've got some questions coming in here. Oh, more comments. Clark says, thanks, Paul. Give you guys a minute here to ask any last pressing questions you might have. I love that some of you really got into the details, right? Looking at some of those little things in there, which is something we get caught up in all the time. So it's really fun to share those and see what people spot as well. And we've looked at images sometimes for years, and then somebody takes a look at it with a fresh pair of eyes and notices something we've never seen before.
We had, Alex remembers, we had a guy named Bill Smith who was an instructor at Mount Sac. And when we had slides, he would come every summer and organize and work on that. He was really good at picking out, as Max Van Bogo was too, one of our boss for many years. The two of them were really good at piecing together timeframes for when things were done. So we've learned a lot from people who have worked with us in the past.
Absolutely. Janet is asking, did an El Encanto treat TB originally?
Well, by the 40s, it's possible they could have had TB patients. Our area was known for that from the late 1800s. The whole Monrovia, Duarte, Upper Pasadena area was filled with sanitaria that treated TB patients way back then. By the 40s, I'm sure there were some, but it was the name sanitarium was applied to a lot of things. And again, I think a lot of it was people who had declined in terms of their cognition.
Great. Okay, we'll see if we have any other comments coming in here. Any other questions? I think it's always great too, the stories we hear from people that have kind of carried down about the mystery tunnels under the house are things sometimes we've heard. And when you were talking about the exterior, the faux granite facade, I remember when I first started many, many years ago, I even heard stories where people said, well, yeah, that was, the nicks that are in the exterior facade, those are from Indian attacks. All of these myths and stories that get perpetuated.
Yeah, that was my first tour. I took it in February 1988. That's what they said, same thing. And yeah, I was going to bring up the tunnel thing, but it was a lot to cover. But yeah, supposedly there was a tunnel in this basement area, not this particular room, but in the basement that either went to the creek or down to the cemetery. And we've got a brick in the collection, Adobe brick that's labeled "found at the creek," and that kind of thing. Like an opening was there. So who knows? It's certainly possible.
Okay, we've got one comment. Says, great insight into the history and construction of the homestead. Thank you. Really enjoyed today's virtual tour. Judy and Larry ask, the 1920 overview photo didn't show any wheat fields. Were there any still in the area then?
In the 20s, there might have been some hay and wheat grown here and there, but this was really walnuts in the valley floor, up in Hacienda Heights, citrus and avocados. Those were high dollar crops. So the wheat and other field crops were not as, that was more of a 19th century thing, more of, even before oranges. So Workman had 5,000 acres of wheat back in the mid 1800s, for example, but that had changed quite a bit.
Okay, a few more questions and comments coming in. Janet says, thanks, Paul. I learned a lot too. And Janet's one of our longtime docents. Yep. Glad you did, Janet. I'm with you. Desiree says, indigenous finds, collection of homeowners, or what was found in terms of indigenous objects with the archaeology?
Yeah, so we found monos. Those are probably the predominant things we have found. This site had been very close to, well, the native village was Awigna, and it's been described in various sources as either being at La Puente High School, La Puente City Park area, or right near the cemetery at our place. And I think it could have been both. If the water was high, you're going to move your village further away from it. If it's lower, you might want to be closer to that, because obviously water is the life source. And this property where the homestead was a knoll. It was built up on a rise. We don't really see as much of it today, although you get some traces of that even today. So it was probably a choice place for the native peoples to be because of their village and because it's a little bit higher and it's near the water. So finding all these things makes a lot of sense. We have since turned over everything that we have had in the collection to the Quiche Gabileño band of Mission Indians who we've worked with, because we feel repatriation is what we should be doing.
Yeah, lots of interesting comments and questions about water and ranching today. So that's something for us to keep in mind in terms of thinking of future programs, subjects you all might be interested in. So feel free to drop some other things in the chat that you're really curious or interested in after today's program. Yeah. Brenda asks, at El Campo Santo, what year was it restored due to water damage through the years? Seems like 10 years ago or so.
Oh, we had leaking in the mausoleum, and I'm going to say it's probably closer to 15 to almost 20. Does that sound right, Alex?
That does, yeah. I think more than 10.
But yeah, they had to do some pretty extensive work in there. And one of the things that was done, which is really neat, is they put in fans, electric fans that will keep airflow in there and hopefully mitigate, the conditions that could cause more of that type of thing. But yeah, we had beautiful decorative, almost like wallpaper on the ceiling that had been peeling off because of exposure to water. So fortunately, we had the support of the city all these years to do things like that, because that stuff can be pretty expensive to do.
Yeah, and Ed Pinson, I remember him up on the ladders working on those.
Yeah, kind of like Michelangelo. We used to joke that he should be laying on his back and doing this. His neck was, he had to take breaks pretty frequently, right?
Absolutely. Okay, let's see if there's any other comments or questions here. Yeah, the pictures at the end were just so fascinating. So I'm glad you included so many of those.
Well, and hopefully we can do one on La Casa Nueva too, to kind of bring these two together, because that has its own interesting history. It won't be as long, but it'll certainly be interesting to go through that, because we have blueprints and a little better documentation of that house than we do the Workman House.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you again so much for joining us. Oh yes, Desiree says, yes, please. She wants one program on La Casa Nueva. So that's in the works. We got it. So thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate you spending time with us and remaining connected with us virtually in these strange times. You will receive an evaluation in your email box tomorrow. It'll also have a link to today's recorded program. And I apologize, we had sent an email out with a half-hour difference in start time. So I know 2 of you came in later today. So most definitely, please go back and look at that link, and we'll make sure we check our emails before they go out a bit better next time. And again, I did drop a link to our recorded program archive in the chat. So if you've missed other programs, please check them out, share them with your friends. This is new for us during the pandemic to be recording programs and sharing them, but we're getting some nice response and reaction from you all. So we'll try to keep doing that. Okay. So it looks like that's about it. More thank yous and looking forward to future programs. We are too. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.